Valkyrie in Clash Royale doesn't stand out in any significant way. She's never been game-breaking, but not too bad either. She's not the most memorable card, but not forgotten. I wanted to make a video covering her because she isn't really talked about much nowadays, and one of the reasons I created this channel was to bring a spotlight to cards that weren't fairly recognized. Like many cards, Valkyrie has done her part to shape the game, and certainly received her fair share of balance changes. I was actually going to cover this card a while ago, but because she received an evolution, I decided to postpone it to see how it settled out. If you include the evolution, Valkyrie has received a total of 15 balance changes. There's certainly a lot to go over, so let's go back 8 years to the beginning of the history of the Valkyrie. Valkyrie was released all the way at the start of beta on January 4th, 2016 as one of the original 42. She was a troop that had already existed in Clash Royale's predecessor, Clash of Clans, and her function in that game is similar to this one. She's a splash troop, but unlike every other splash troop, her splash radius wasn't in front of her, but rather surrounding her. She was always the center of her splash radius, having a 360-degree hurt box. You see, against other splash cards, you could play a swarm on them very precisely so their attack couldn't wipe out all the units at once, making it an effective counter, but that didn't really work against Valkyrie. Unlike Clash of Clans, she moved pretty slow, being classified under the medium speed category. She also attacked quite slow, only every 1.6 seconds. She definitely wasn't good at taking out tankier cards because she dealt little damage per second for her cost, but she had a good amount of health for her cost, being able to survive even the biggest, most expensive spells at just 4 elixir. Another major plus was that she was originally completely immune to all forms of knockback. It made sense. She was heavy because she wore armor and carried a big axe, which also meant she moved slow and was hard to push around. Valkyrie definitely stood out and had a unique purpose, and on the plus side, she was very simple. Casual players understood her and her mechanics clearly, making her a popular choice. However, back in January 2016, she wasn't exactly thriving competitively. According to the earliest top ladder statistic available, on January 16th, 2016, she was only in 7% of top ladder decks, which is okay by today's standard, but that was very low for the time. You'd think she'd be more popular with how prevalent the Barbarians card was, but she wasn't even an effective counter to them, because even with her splash, her versus 4 Barbarians was an uphill battle. The Barbarians had too much health and damage output, so overall, Valkyrie was just too niche to thrive competitively. Wizard was actually the favorite splash card. It could do pretty much anything a Valkyrie could do, but better. But most importantly, he had the advantage of being able to attack air units, which was necessary in this environment because Minion Horde was in literally half of the top ladder decks. Baby Dragon was also popular for similar reasons. By the beginning of February, the card's use rate had dropped even lower. It was the worst performing splash troop in the game. Now, it did have a lot of health, so that was the main advantage it had over other splash cards. But not only did that not matter in most situations, the Knight was more efficient in situations where the health of the Valkyrie might put it over other splashers. Even though the Knight was not a splash card, it was often used in situations a Valkyrie was used in, so the Valk was also competing with him a bit. But the thing that seems to be hurting it the most at the moment was Tombstone being the most popular card in competitive play, because Tombstone spawned waves of skeletons constantly, so the Valkyrie practically stood in place, unable to get anywhere when going against it. So with everything going against Valkyrie, Supercell decided to give it a buff on February 9th, 2016. Its first balance change was simply a hit speed decrease of 1/10 of a second, which was a very small buff, especially for such a weak card. It was an unnoticeable change that didn't encourage more people to use it. But that wasn't all. Later in the month, Valkyrie would get 2 more significant changes, which were just consistency changes, but they still helped her. The first was a sight range decrease, which made her harder to distract, and she was also changed to move immediately if she killed her target during her attack. Before this, whenever she killed a troop and there was nothing else in range, instead of walking immediately, she would just freeze in place for a second, which made her significantly worse. This is especially what made Tombstone so effective against her before. By March, it was one of the only 3 cards in the game to not be used by even a single top ladder player. It fell to 0% quickly after the Dark Prince was added, which was another 4 elixir card that had a 360-degree splash mechanic, so that little bit of room Valkyrie had was gone. She was completely boxed out. The card clearly needed some big buffs if it was going to have any chance in the metagame, so Supercell for the 3rd time already buffed Valkyrie. On March 23, 2016, she would receive a health increase of 10% and a damage increase of 10%. This essentially meant she had the stats of a +1 level Valkyrie, because the health and damage stats increased by about 10% each level. I actually checked the exact numbers, and apparently the new Valkyrie had the exact same health as a previous +1 level Valkyrie, but the damage was exactly 1 less than a previous +1 level Valk. 1 damage really doesn't mean anything, but I just thought it was interesting. At the time, this was probably one of the biggest buffs a card had received. Funny enough, players underestimated this buff at first, thinking it wasn't much because Valkyrie was laughably awful before this. But these changes really brought her into the spotlight. She started the month seeing no top ladder usage, but by the end of the month, she was seen in a whopping 23% of top ladder decks, which sounds like a lot, but that's really only slightly above average, as that's equivalent to about a 10% usage rate today. But that's still a significant increase from nothing. Valkyrie was competitively viable for the first time ever. You were seeing her a lot with Hog Rider, more specifically Hog Freeze decks. Hog Freeze decks had always existed, and Valkyrie was being integrated in them because she actually worked quite well with the freeze herself. Despite having a high amount of hit points for her cost, she could actually be melted if you placed her right in the middle of a big push, but that's typically where you wanted to place her so she could hit as many troops as possible with each swing. So the freeze was useful in protecting her, allowing her to get plenty of hits after being placed in the middle of a push, eliminating all danger before they even had a chance to attack. It was an expensive combo at 8 elixir, but hey, if you're shutting down a 16 elixir push, it's worth it. Valkyrie also worked well with Hog Rider, because as we went over, Valkyrie was slow, and that worked against her most of the time. But if you placed her in front of a Hog Rider, the Hog Rider would push her forward, getting her to the tower much quicker than she would get on her own. The Hog boosted the Valkyrie forward, and the Valkyrie acted as the Hog Rider's shield. It was like a trifecta because all 3 cards just worked so well with each other in so many ways, but I probably shouldn't use the word trifecta here because of what I'm about to talk about next. On May 3rd, 2016, Valkyrie would receive yet another balance change, and this would be the first nerf she ever received. Her knockback immunity was revoked. She'd now take knockback just like any other medium-sized unit. Supercell claims they did this for consistency reasons. Valkyrie wasn't massive like a P.E.K.K.A or Giant, so it just felt wrong she couldn't be knocked back when something of similar size like Knight or Hog Rider did. This change really only affected it against giant skeleton bombs, fireballs, and rockets. It didn't really affect the card much now, but it did set the groundwork for it to be much worse in the future when other knockback dealing cards were added. In the meantime, the card was surging in popularity. A new Hog Rider deck was trending, which quickly became iconic. It was simply known as Hog Trifecta, sometimes being shortened to just Trifecta. It was a Hog cycle deck, and this was the main variant going around. It was built around the Hog Rider, Valkyrie, and Musketeer. The Trifecta. You cycle to those cards as quickly as you needed them. The other 5 cards were purely meant to support these 3. This deck was the most popular deck in the game for a while, and Valk played a key role in it, which carried her a long way. Hog Trifecta remains as the #1 deck for months, not phasing out until around August, when Hog cycle decks as a whole were dying out, which was bad for Valk because Hog Trifecta was pretty much all she had, but as Bowler got more prevalent, Hog Rider decks were subbing Valkyrie out. Her not being immune to knockback was finally coming back to bite her. However, over the course of September and October, she managed to squeeze her way into a few new popular Hog Rider decks, but none of them reached the prominence of Hog Trifecta. But Trifecta would pretty much go away for good following the massive Poison and Elixir Collector nerfs in October, subsequently leading to a massive fall in Valkyrie usage. By November, she was back to seeing absolutely no play in top ladder. The squashing of Trifecta wasn't the only thing that caused her to fall, however. A new card, the Ice Golem, was also released and was frequently replacing the Valkyrie in most popular Hog Rider decks. It served a similar function, but had way more health per elixir than Valkyrie since it was only half the cost, and it was a building targeting troop just like the Hog Rider, so you couldn't split the two apart very easily. On top of that, it dealt death damage and slowness to anything around it upon death, which took out skeletons, and with the assistance of the Zap spell, which was used in almost every deck already anyway, could take out goblins and even minions. So with Ice Golem taking away Valkyrie's only purpose, she had no purpose. Valkyrie was still a popular mid-ladder choice due to her being more simple and just feeling more powerful, but once you got to a certain point, you would want to discard her. However, because a lot of players perceived her to be strong, Supercell hesitated on buffing her. Despite having her synergies nerfed and new competition boxing her out, several months would come and go with no balance changes or major developments. The next notable development is in March 2017. Valk's use rate this season would rise over 1% usage in top ladder for the first time in 6 months to about 4%, which still isn't good, but what caused it to rise at all? Well, it was thanks to a new variant of, you guessed it, Hog Rider. The reason Valkyrie was chosen in this deck rather than Ice Golem was partially thanks to it being way more effective against Graveyard. Ice Golem wouldn't attack skeletons, but rather let them build up and then destroy them all at once with its Frost Nova, and you had to place it sort of in the back so it wouldn't walk out of the radius, but then the skeletons on top would not be taken care of. This became even less effective when its Frost Nova radius was shrunk down. Valkyrie was an ideal graveyard counter because she could hit a large number of troops at once and tank through any spell, and she wouldn't just walk away from the graveyard as skeletons were still coming up. Even though Valkyrie maintained some usage in top ladder for a few months, the Knight was really starting to outshine it. Valk's small presence in top ladder was completely gone once again. Even by October, Valk didn't appear to be making any sort of comeback, which meant she was basically not viable in competitive play throughout all of 2017. So finally that month, Valkyrie would receive her first balance change in over a year. On October 9th, 2017, Valkyrie's damage would be increased by 5%, which meant she took out barbarians in 3 hits instead of 4, and one-shot princesses and dark goblins. It was a nice buff, but it still didn't attract high-level players. Her usage rate still remained at 0% in top ladder for the remainder of 2017, so on February 12th, 2018, she was buffed yet again. But it was just another hit speed decrease of 1/10 of a second. This buff seemed to garner some interest, but as I already stated, a 1/10 of a second hit speed change is practically unnoticeable. In top ladder for the February season, a few Logbait players subbed out the Knight for Valkyrie, but her use rate was still critically low, and by the next season, it was back down to almost 0 again. Supercell was not giving up though. On June 4th, 2018, Valkyrie received yet another buff. She would get a health increase of 7% and a first hit attack time decrease of 0.2 of a second. This meant she could fully deny all the damage from a Goblin Barrel and fully take out 3 Musketeers. Her first hit attack time was actually instant now, which was very unusual as really the only cards to have an instant first hit attack were charging cards like the Princes or rapid firing cards like the Expo. The health buff was pretty significant too because this meant she had more health than a bowler. This was a pretty controversial balance change just because of her prominence in lower ladder, but Supercell was determined to get Valkyrie into a healthy state competitively at this point. I think this change was really motivated by 3 Musketeers. 3 Musketeers were so dominant throughout 2018 that Supercell was making a conscious effort to buff counters to them due to the refusal to nerf them directly. This was the 6th buff it had received in 3 years, with the only nerf it ever getting being losing her immunity to knockback. But this buff finally seemed to do the trick, as Valkyrie started appearing much more frequently after this. She was very popular in Bait and Hog Rider decks, which was no surprise considering she was seen in those types of decks a lot before, but she also started appearing frequently in minor cycle decks. She was now just an overall good mini tank for countering a variety of things. Now, when choosing between a Knight, Ice Golem, or Valkyrie, Valkyrie was generally the favorite of the 3. She was officially meta for the first time in years. The only time she really felt meta before was the few months of Trifecta prominence in mid-2016. And even though Trifecta carried Valkyrie far, I still think this era was much better for her because she was seen play in a bigger variety of decks rather than relying on the popularity of one single deck. In July, she became even more of a necessity because the Witch was buffed. Valkyrie has always been one of the best counters to Witch, but Witch was never really meta up until now. She was really good after the July 2018 buff, so the demand for Valkyrie was higher than ever. She was undoubtedly by far the best mini tank at this point. Players were very frustrated at this card now, saying she was OP and needed massive nerfs. The thing people seemed to hate most were her hit points. She had more hit points than a Prince and a Bowler, and that just didn't seem right for a 4 elixir card with so much else going for it. With all the outrage, she would quickly receive a nerf in the September 2018 balance changes, but rather than nerfing her hit points like many wanted, her hit speed was instead increased by 0.2 of a second, and her first hit attack time was increased by 0.2 of a second, so both stats were just reverted to what they originally were. But why did they choose hit speed of all stats to nerf? Well, Seth, the community manager, actually explains the thought process behind this balance change in an interview. He was basically saying that Valkyrie already had the lowest health per elixir compared to all the other mini tanks, and they were afraid that if they lowered her health anymore, she would fall out of the mini tank category. Plus, on top of that, they felt Valkyrie was too similar to Dark Prince and wanted to separate them. They cost the same, had 360-degree splash, as well as an instant first hit attack. and before this change, their hit speed was only a difference of 1/10 of a second. The Dark Prince already had less hit points than a Valk, so decreasing the Valk's hit points would have made them even more similar. With this balance change, their hit speeds would be much different, and Valkyrie would perform much worse in one-on-one interactions. She was never really meant to be a dueler like Knight was anyway. This nerf seemed to be fine, however the rates suggested this nerf was a little over the top. So in January 2019, they walked back halfway on the nerfs from the previous set of balance changes, citing that it was still underperforming despite the meta revolving around Three Musketeers, of which was a meta the teams believed Valkyrie should have thrived in. This change didn't quite bring the card back up to statistically healthy rates, but a buff is a buff. In the following months, Valkyrie's rates would hold just below average, still really only being seen in Bait, Minor Cycle, or replacing the Knight in this iconic Hog X NATO deck. There weren't really any new decks including her. She had her place, but it was niche, which is not the worst position for a card to be in, but this called into question its long-term stability. Could it possibly adapt to the ever-changing landscape in the long run? On April 15th, 2019, the Earthquake spell was released. It integrated into Hog Rider decks pretty fast, some of which included the Valkyrie. So it did appear to be adaptable to some extent, but the rates still weren't getting much better. The idea of buffing it at this point was iffy. The card honestly wasn't even that much worse stat-wise from its pre-September 2018 state. It only hit 1/10 of a second slower since her state where she was considered to be way too strong. Come July 2019, she would actually receive another balance change. There was a massive standardization to all melee cards, where their range had to be put into one of three categories. Valkyrie had a range of exactly one tile, which was exactly in the middle of the melee short and melee medium categories. Supercell could have chosen to slightly reduce or slightly increase her range to make her fit into either one, and they decided to increase her to be melee medium. But an unmentioned balance change came with this. This was a splash radius increase of 4/10 of a tile. Now, this might be seen as just a standard consistency change as I originally thought, but it gets a little more complicated than that. This is a good time to explain the difference between range and splash radius in regard to Valkyrie. Range is the minimum distance the edge of a troop's collision radius has to be from its target in order to initiate its attack. The splash radius is the distance from the center to the edge of a card's attack. Let's just use the numbers from pre-July 2019 to keep this simple. Valkyrie had a range of 1 with a collision radius of half a tile, so she could essentially attack cards 1.5 tiles from her center, but she had a splash radius of 2. Since the splash radius begins from the center of the collision radius and the range starts from the edge, the splash radius has to be equal to or greater than the sum of the attack range and collision radius, which is 1.5 tiles in this case, in order for her attack to actually hit her target. So for all of Clash Royale history up to this point, her splash radius has been half a tile larger than it needed to be for the edge of her attack to reach her target. It appears they wanted to keep the initiative range splash radius ratio the same, but there was a problem here because her collision radius was remaining exactly the same, and if it were to be truly proportional, they'd have to increase that too. So increasing the splash radius without increasing the collision radius meant she'd now reach 7/10 of a tile beyond the tip of her range instead of 5/10 of a tile, which meant now she outranged every other melee card in Clash Royale. No longer would the Prince or Night Witch be able to safely sit outside the Valkyrie's radius while it was busy dealing with something else. What's crazy is that none of this was intended to happen. There was no intention to make her significantly stronger. These changes were entirely based on a new standardization rule, and they felt like they were doing the bare minimum to make her fit into a category, which is why no one batted an eye when it was first announced. But the effect it had was undoubtedly massive. Valkyrie had a huge spike in usage following the balance changes, and she was considered to be about the same, if not better, than her pre-September 2018 state. Players knew she was much stronger than before, but many didn't understand why. I read many old comments of people trying to explain why the Valkyrie was the way she was, and many forums had lots of people discussing this where not one person was actually able to give the correct explanation. I'm not kidding, it took me over an hour to write the paragraph I'm currently writing just because of how confusing this was. I don't even know if Supercell themselves knew of the effects these range increases would have on her. It was labeled as a bug, but technically it wasn't. It was just Supercell applying weird stats. The very next month, Supercell fixed this issue by decreasing the Valk's splash radius by half a tile. But the way this balance change was presented is what made this more confusing to me. When these balance changes were posted on Reddit by Supercell, it claims Valkyrie's range went from 1.9 to 1.2 tiles, but that's just not true. And that's proven by the fact that if you take a close look at Valkyrie 1v1ing a melee long troop, you clearly see the enemy troop starts initiating their attack first, which wouldn't happen if the Valkyrie's range was 1.9 tiles. On YouTube, Supercell doesn't even show a direct stat change. It just says she no longer outranges melee long troops. If this really was a range reduction, they could have just said range fixed or range decreased. But they worded it so complicatedly because someone else at Supercell knew this wasn't a range decrease, but wasn't sure what it was. I think whoever made this video had no idea what the Valk change even was, so they just said what the change was meant to do rather than giving stats. The fact that even people at Supercell couldn't be clear on what the Valk changes were just goes to show how confusing this was. I know I've been on this for a while, but I just couldn't fathom how complicated this was, and I wanted to explain it in depth because I don't think anyone really understood what was happening. But another thing I wondered was why the splash radius was decreased to be less than what it was when Valkyrie had a 1-tile range. They could have just reverted it back to 2 tiles and everything would have been fine, but they went that extra 1/10 of a tile. But really, why did they ever increase the splash radius in the first place? Did they even know what they were doing? Funny enough, in the September update the following month, her splash radius was silently increased back to 2 tiles, exactly what it was before this whole mess started, which makes me believe that increasing it in the first place was one of the dumbest balancing decisions in Clash Royale history. But looking at the September tweak, going from 1.9 to 2 tiles was such an insignificant change, and the fact that it wasn't mentioned in any patch notes raises some questions. Why didn't they just make it 2 in August? Why bother increasing it by 1 measly 10th of a tile but not tell anyone? Since it was so small and not mentioned in any patch notes, I genuinely don't think anyone noticed. I couldn't find a single person anywhere acknowledging this change. It's incredibly easy to miss since the splash radius stat has always been a hidden stat for Valk. Even the Valkyrie wiki didn't include this change in our history until July 2023, almost 4 years after it happened. There's so little evidence to support this change actually happening, I hesitated even including it in this video. I looked hard and far, but I cannot find the intention behind this change. Community managers never mentioned it. Perhaps it wasn't even intentional, but since it was so inconsequential, they never bothered to change it back. There's so little information on it, it's just baffling to me. We'll likely never know for sure. Since the August nerf, Valkyrie had been back to being sort of a slightly underpowered but still viable mini-tank, and because of her consistent popularity in lower ladder and the hate she received from newer players, a buff seemed out of the question. At this point though, I'd say she was in a pretty healthy spot, but everything was about to change, because even though Valkyrie was healthy, the meta wasn't about to be. Only a few days after its secret splash buff, Season 4 was upon us. Remember when I said earlier Valkyrie had garnered some popularity due to a demand for good witch counters? For the second and last time in Clash Royale history, Witch was meta again due to a failed rework which made it way too strong. But this time, the Witch was way stronger than she was for that brief period in 2018. She was game-breaking, and was the most popular troop in the game, appearing in about half of challenge decks. And on top of that, Valkyrie was excellent at countering the new Elixir Golem, since after you took out its first form, it broke into multiple less tanky units, which Valkyrie was efficient at clearing up. Miner's Cycle had a new surge of popularity thanks to the newly buffed wall breakers, so one of the main deck archetypes she was thriving in got a nice boost overall for the season. Season 4 was set up to be the perfect environment for Valkyrie to thrive. Within days of the new season, her rates surged in grand challenges, becoming one of the most popular troops in the game, standing among other cards that got overbuffed. This was by far her all-time peak, and it clearly expressed how healthy she was. It was clear now that if there was a meta Valkyrie should have thrived in, she was going to thrive in it. Along with Minor Cycle, Valkyrie was making frequent appearances in Splash Yard and Ice Bow. Clearly, once inevitable nerfs to the meta drivers came, Valkyrie would fall with them. But despite Wallbreaker, Witch, and Elixir Golem nerfs in November 2019, Valk was still seen in about a quarter of challenge decks. Minor Cycle was still incredibly strong, and Elixir Golem remained prominent. Executioner was also surging in November, so you saw a lot of Valk in Hog X NATO. Even with further disfavoring indirect nerfs in December, Valk was looking good. There was even briefly a Lava Hound deck she was performing well in. Questions arose once again regarding her long-term stability though. Although she had had above average rates for 3 months by the end of 2019, it was hard to tell exactly where she was going to land once the problematic cards were toned down even further. But even after another major Elixir Golem nerf in January 2020, she was still doing alright. At this point, it was clear she wasn't just being used because the meta demanded for her as an Elixir Golem counter, but rather the Minor Cycle decks Valkyrie was present in were thriving so much thanks to the Wallbreaker and Magic Archer buffs in those final few months of the year. Valkyrie may have only had an uptick in popularity originally due to the crazy Season 4 meta, but her rates were not returning back to what they were pre-Season 4 despite multiple sets of balance changes disfavoring her. She found a niche and was good at what she did. Unfortunately though, Supercell kept indirectly nerfing her by nerfing other cards in these Minor Cycle decks. Minor was nerfed nerfed in March 2020, Magic Archer was nerfed in April 2020, Wall Breakers and Bomb Tower were nerfed in June 2020, and Miner was nerfed again in August 2020 along with bats and spells. So Miner decks like this faded into irrelevance. Likewise, over the course of 2020, Valkyrie's rates finally dwindled down. Miner decks did manage to adapt to the nerfs, but Valkyrie was no longer desired for them. The next time she had any notable development was following the March 2021 balance changes. She didn't receive any direct alterations, but once again, there were several changes that indirectly affected her. The Elite Barbarians were buffed, which brought them back with the Elixir Golem, both of which Valk could handle pretty well. The Mother Witch was also given some generous buffs. Since naturally her role was to summon a lot of hogs, Valk could be helpful in a situation where they were becoming overwhelming. This can explain why you were seeing a lot of Valkyrie with Graveyard after the balance changes. And for the cherry on top, the Knight's health was decreased, making the health per elixir more even. She wasn't nearly as popular as she was in late 2019, but it's still notable. So now you'd probably assume this would play out the same way as last time. Valk thrives in an unbalanced meta, balance changes come, and she phases out. But that's not exactly what happens this time. Just as the balance changes in June 2021 were fixing the mistakes from the March balance changes, a new card, the Goblin Drill, was added. And like just about every card released nowadays, this card was game-breakingly OP upon launch. It basically had the same function as a miner, but it was a spawner building. Most cards did not counter this card very well, but Valkyrie was not one of those cards. She was arguably the best counter to the Goblin Drill. The only other troop that might have been better is the Dark Prince, mainly because the Goblin Drill dealt knockback upon entry, so immunity to knockback gave it a leg up. Regardless, she surged to being the most used troop in Clash Royale shortly after Drill's introduction, the most usage she's seen since Season 4. This Hog Earthquake deck specifically was trending during this era, but she also worked her way into a few popular Drill decks. I believe that if Dark Prince didn't exist, Valkyrie's use rate would have been in the 30s, perhaps even peaking to a new all-time high. Goblin Drill wouldn't be nerfed until September, but in that set of balance changes, Royal Hogs were buffed, so Valkyrie was still useful. 2021 was really such a good year for Valk if you think about it. Ever since the March 2021 balance changes, there was something keeping Valkyrie in the meta. Every time they fixed one thing that was causing Valk to surge, another thing took its place. Valkyrie was just so unique that these opportunities for her were more frequent than they'd be for other cards. Now, Royal Hogs definitely weren't as influential as the Goblin Drill, so Valk's rates did dwindle a bit, but she was still doing great. The next notable development would be after Champions were released, but more specifically after some major Skeleton King buffs in November. Skeleton King pioneered a new era of Swarm. He synergized best with Swarm cards because more units dying meant he could summon more skeletons. Skeleton King's summons were very sporadic and got pretty messy, therefore difficult for most splash cards to handle, so this was a great chance for the Valk's 360-degree radius to shine again. If you placed her right on the king, she could easily take it out and pull and take out any skeletons that tried to stop her, as well as be decent against the supporting swarms. Players were squeezing her into just about anything now as a protection against those decks. Also, you have to remember, she had already been one of the most popular cards in mid-ladder consistently, usually sitting at the #1 spot for troop cards. Yes, even higher than Mega Knight and Hog Rider. I haven't been bringing this up, but mid-ladder players have been clamoring for nerfs for a while by this point, despite her being relatively balanced competitively. But now she was one of the most used cards competitively as well, so it appeared Valkyrie was just too strong in general now. The usage was even higher than the Skeleton King, which is supposedly what was boosting her right now. So with this card now being so frequently used in all areas of the game, it was time for a nerf. On April 4th, 2022, Valkyrie would receive her last balance change to date. This would be nothing more than a simple health reduction of 4%. Supercell finally gave in to those players back in 2018 who were clamoring for health nerfs. In fact, I found this one comment suggesting a 4% HP nerf exactly posted 4 years before this change was implemented, so I guess Supercell should have just listened to him in the first place. There were no major interaction changes caused by this reduction, but obviously it could only hurt the card. I think it was the right move, because although Skeleton King would get nerfed in the later months, which would naturally drive down demand for Valkyrie, it was still doing pretty well before the Skeleton King edition, and clearly it had other factors making it popular besides him. This change was also a nice gesture to those mid-ladder players who were just tired of her. Observing its performance in the preceding months only confirms this notion. It was still used a lot because it was useful and had a massive appeal, and it was still also the most used troop in general ladder. But things started to go pretty downhill in 2023. It didn't happen all at once, but Valkyrie's use and win rates were trickling down throughout the year. Her Her win rates were low, and they were only getting lower, way below what a healthy card should have. The final nail in the coffin was the addition of the Knight evolution. The Knight evolution caused the Knight to explode in popularity. It was extremely good and thus boxed out all the other mini-tanks. Valkyrie's rates tanked overnight corresponding with his addition. It could tank way more than Valk could and had a much faster hit speed than the original Knight, so although Valk was still clearly the best option for dealing with swarms, Knight wasn't nearly as weak against them anymore, so he was good enough. And remember, he was one less elixir. He completely stole the spotlight, leaving Valkyrie in the dust. This situation is an example portraying the biggest flaw with evolutions. An evolution only makes a card better. There is no downside or trade-off. It gets a stat increase and a special ability, so a card simply having one means it will basically box out any card in its category that doesn't have one. Even with the inevitable evolved Knight nerfs, it was still boxing her out because they weren't trying to put him on the same level as the other mini-tanks, they were trying to put him on the same level as other evolutions. He'd still be a much better mini-tank because a non-evolved card fundamentally can't compete with an evolved one. Fortunately, only a few months after the Knight's evolution was implemented, in January 2024, it was the Valkyrie's turn. She was one of the lucky cards selected to get one, and she definitely needed it with the way she was being overshadowed. So how would this evolution change Valkyrie? She wouldn't get any stat buffs from this, but she got a really cool whirlwind ability which functions similarly to Tornado. Every time she attacked, this whirlwind would initiate. It had a radius of 5.5 tiles, which is exactly the same as a tornado spell. It also dealt more damage per second than Tornado, but it only lasted for half a second instead of a full second, so it did less damage overall, meaning it couldn't even take out skeletons. But while Tornado dealt 35% of its damage to ground towers, evolved Valk's Tornado did 45%. It was still less overall, but not as bad as it could have been. The most interesting part of this ability, I think, is the fact that it affected air troops. The reason this is so interesting to me is because she could only target ground, so Valkyrie was now the only troop that couldn't target air but could attack air. I think the concept here was great. It was different, it fit her perfectly, the only problem was that it just wasn't good. Her ability really only made a difference in a few niche situations. Valkyrie pulling stuff didn't matter much because anything she'd be used to counter would just be running towards her anyway. In some situations, it actually made things worse for her because it would pull dangerous troops to her way quicker, which would lead to her dying sooner than she otherwise would. If it weren't for the evolved Ice Spirit, evolved Valkyrie easily could have been considered the worst evolution. Pretty much anything that normally countered her would be just as effective as before. I find it kind of funny because when this was first revealed, people were panicking, thinking that this Evo was going to be game-breakingly overpowered. The idea of a melee card having a 5.5 tile range does sound scary in concept, and I think people thought it was going to have the power of a normal Tornado, but it was a much weaker version of it. By mid-February, her use and win rates were abysmal. Since evolutions were basically required to use to compete, and with every deck having 2 slots for them, and with 13 available in February, this meant the average use rate for an evolution was about 15%, as opposed to about 7% for a normal card. Now I know I said the Valkyrie's last balance change was in April 2022, but her evolved form did receive some adjusting given her abhorrent performance. In March 2024, Valkyrie in her evolved form only would receive a health increase of 15%. At the time, most evolutions did have some sort of stat increase in addition to their abilities, so this made sense. It seemed strange that they didn't just give her a stat increase at the get-go, but they may have just been tired of the community complaining about them releasing broken evolutions, and thus they were purposely releasing them a little underpowered so they could slowly buff it to an appropriate place rather than having everyone rage and call them greedy cell. Buffing the health felt like the appropriate move because it really felt like she died so quickly. Even though this was the opposite change of what mid-ladder players were begging for, it was alright since it only affected the evolved version and most mid-ladder players did not have access to it. Following the changes going live, Evo Valk was noticeably performing better. She was still doing okay in Lava Hound and Goblin Drill decks, but she didn't even seem to be too important. Supercell wasn't done though. In the next set of balance changes, Evolved Valkyrie would be changed yet again, and this would be the final one to date. But rather than a straight buff, she would get a rework. Her health was decreased by 4%, but her tornado ability damage was increased by 11%, meaning the Whirlwind now took out skeletons and bats, which I think for the bats specifically was a huge deal because she couldn't take those out with her regular attack. This rework was part of an overhaul that was meant to put the focus on Evolution's abilities rather than their stat bonuses, which I think was a step in the right direction. Even though this change sounds like it would keep Valkyrie around the same power level, maybe even a bit worse than before, it's important to know that almost every other evolution got some sort of nerf as well, so the evolution playing field was becoming much more level for underperformers like Valkyrie. So did the balance changes help or hurt Valkyrie overall? It's hard to say. Her rates didn't change much, but I think it made her a little better. Ever since May, she seemed to be mostly riding the success of Lava Loon. It seemed to be the single archetype keeping her from being irrelevant. As recent as July 2024, Tesla received some pretty big nerfs which only helped Lava Loon more. The evolved Valk saw the most usage yet thanks to that. So I'd say she's in a very good spot at the moment, but we'll just have to see what the future brings. The one thing I really can't get over is the Valkyrie's appearance. I don't talk about this stuff much in these videos as I like to focus on analytics and core gameplay, but she got a card art change in 2022 and the evolved version of her looks so different from the regular version. These new card arts were so significant that they got people talking. A simple text post on Reddit got thousands of upvotes that were simply stating their hatred of the updated card art, and I've seen countless comments ragging on the evolved Valkyrie's looks, and I gotta agree with all of it, especially when taking a look at the other versions of the evolved Valkyrie that were considered. I definitely think we could have had something better. As for the future, if it was up to me, I wouldn't give Valk or evolved Valkyrie any balance changes. I think it's in a solid place, and unless its place radically shifts, it doesn't need a change. I'm a little surprised Supercell hasn't been more harsh over the years towards her for being the most popular low to mid ladder troop, since certain cards have gotten some harsh treatment for being in the position Valkyrie's been in for years. But I suppose I shouldn't be, because it seems like someone at Supercell likes Valkyrie a little too much. Anyway, I just wanted to make this video because I think this card is really cool and has an interesting story, and I don't see it talked about much nowadays. Let me know what you think about the card and if you agreed with Supercell's balancing decisions. Also, let me know which card's history you want to see next. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you later.